Peter, you have a very interesting background, having worked both in advertising and equity trading. Let's talk about advertising first. What function does this industry serve in today's society?
The best way to explain that is to look at the fact that our economy is based on consumption, and advertising is the arm of creating artificial demand. And without that arm, and it's so polluted, as you know, I mean, I can't even imagine what the world would be like without advertising, but without that arm, you wouldn't have people aspiring to things that are highly irrational, abused by our social inclusion. When advertising presents something into the community that seems to be something that some people want, it spreads like a virus and then everybody wants it, because it's an issue of social inclusion, which is a part of our biology, because that's how we identify. We identify and define ourselves by how others see us and how we are included in the group. So it manipulates our most primal sense of humanity in order to sell things. And again, back to my original point, if you didn't have that arm in our consumption-based society since the Industrial Revolution, the economy would collapse. That's a very unique point to make, because when you first start an economy of this nature, like in the agrarian society and then in the handicraft industry, you're meeting demand, right? That's the point, and that makes sense. But at some point, this kernel seed had to change, because when you have such a highly efficient, productive society that we have now, at least in the technical sense, not in distribution sense, because we have poverty and all that, but at least in the technical sense of what we can create, the efficiency, abundance, you have to have demand created now, and that's basically the kernel seed of one of the central flaws of market economics or capitalism that has come to fruition today. Not only destroying human psychology, but destroying the environment simultaneously, because you have an insatiable culture that's been literally generated. And as I detail in my book, in the National Association of Manufacturers, mid-20th century, they were actually arguing that consumerism was the best defense against communism and totalitarianism. This incredible PR campaign went on for, well, it still goes on really, but it's echoes of the original intent to transform society into one that just wants to buy and consume. And then progress, of course, being defined by what we produce. More stuff we produce, the more you buy, the more you own. That must be progress now.
It's an incredibly disturbing just realization that this does nothing to benefit society. In fact, it's just literally created to keep society afloat, the economy afloat.
Yeah. It's a kind of cultural violence. The more people promote consumeristic values, vain, materialistic values, the more they want more and more, of this and that, the more they flaunt that kind of phenomenon, the more they create what is termed by Johan Galtung cultural violence. Because if you create a society that thrives in this type of self-identification, you're basically also promoting not only the destruction of the environment, but the diminishment of others. Because you're saying that I can afford this, I have the status, and I'm better for that, and this person can't. And we see that, phenomenally amplified today in the modern world with the winning community and our lovely president and his rhetoric. It also carries over into misogyny and everything else, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Fairly recently, he said, well, we want to have rich people in charge of the economy because clearly they must be good at it. So then, a complete absence of, where's the sympathy? Where's the actual binding purpose of an economy, which is to provide for everyone, ideally? No. So the sickness has become increasingly more palpable. I often wonder what a world would be like without advertising, which would be a world without marketing and markets. And it can tell you it would be a whole lot different and far more peaceful and sustainable and amiable and just humane than what we see today.
Mm-hmm. From an insider's perspective, how exactly does the stock market work?
Stock market is a proxy system that was developed. It was contrived out of the original foundation, which were a board of directors for a company. So a bunch of people each have $1 million. They get together, they invest, say, 10 of them, $10 million into a company, and then they get dividends, right? That made basic sense, years ago. But someone said, you know what? I want to sell this stock, and this guy's going to buy it from me for a little bit more. I'm going to make money off of that. And then suddenly the exchange system began. And slowly but surely, the idea of selling artificial shares of nothing, effectively, became a means of making money. I call it drone warfare economics. It's just like people that drive drones, they don't see any kind of humanity as they drop bombs across the world. The people that trade the stock market have no idea what they're doing when they're shorting, say, the currency of some small country, effectively contributing to that country's decline. But back to your question, it started off as an innocuous kind of investment strategy, and then it moved into this thing where you have people artificially trading things for no other purpose. 83% of all stocks are owned by 1% of the population. It is one giant money-making machine for the elite. And the financialization of it all, because financial services have become so large, and the money, only 5% of U.S. population is in financial services, yet 30% of all GDP is taken by that. And that doesn't even account for all the growth over the years that is attributed, that we know, to the upper 1%, upper 10%. So this is one of the most powerful political centers now simultaneously, and it's truly despotic that you have effectively the most powerful and profitable system on the planet now, one that creates nothing. It's there to simply make money out of money. So it's a cancerous disease. It's what happens in financially mature nations that have pretty much run out of the angling required to keep as maximizing profits in a given industry. So instead, they move to financialization, and it moves in all sorts of other despotic things like dead peasants insurance. These are companies like Walmart that would take out insurance on their employees and get paid when they die, things like that. So it's just this commodification of everything, put a dollar sign on it, no relationship to anything anymore, abstraction become reality once again.
And high-frequency trading is almost just done with computer algorithms.
When I was in trading, it was the start of artificial intelligence, and the traders around me were like, oh, yeah, it's over. Once Goldman Sachs gets their supercomputers together, most of these companies, when they trade, it's just a little detail some will find interesting, the amount of time they're in a trade is pretty much seconds, because they're fronting other orders, because that's what these companies can do. In other words, they're trading tiny little spreads of pennies, but with heavy amounts of shares in front of other orders. And then they use computers to do this, and then they can generate literally millions of dollars off of fractions of time spent in and out of the market on a giant microprocessing level. Anyone that thinks today, especially, that Wall Street isn't rigged needs to wake up, because there's no way artificial intelligence isn't dominating. It's pretty much all the big investment banks with their artificial intelligence versus other people's artificial intelligence at this point. There's no rhyme or reason to it when it comes to human perception. So in effect, you have this giant money-making machine that the public has been roped into, such as their retirement, and all the things, the IRAs that for some reason are now connected to the market. The market is inflationary driven, which gives it its artificial sense of progress, meaning the more money that we pump into our society, the more it goes into the market, the more it keeps rising. So yeah, if you put in your retirement into the stock market, it will probably rise. It'll crash periodically, and then people will make a fortune off of that too. So anyway, the whole society has been coerced into this nonsensical participation that effectively holds up the most giant and powerful political subclass, the financial sector. And if anyone wanted to see another level of sanity emerge on this planet in a step-by-step process rather than complete structural change, I suggest the abolishment of Wall Street. There's nothing positive about what this institution does. And those that say that it's there to help investment, you can invest in anything with direct money without the need to go IPO. The $700 billion float of Apple has nothing to do with what it actually produces at all. It's just what the people are trading and buying and moving the stock around. It's just the game. And it's too bad that people are so ignorant about that. It's a siphoning machine that is taking basically money from the lower class and bringing it to the upper class through different mechanisms.
A lot of people who are middle class, lower class, don't invest in Wall Street because it's just completely too abstract for them, but everyone participates in debt-based currency and the way that the currency operates. How does it make sense that there is more debt than there is currency?
Good question. Mainly because of the interest that's charged. Because in capitalism, every product has to have something that makes money, that makes a profit. And then when the sale of money, which is what banks do, they create and sell money effectively. When they lower and raise interest rates, they're changing the price of what it's going to cost you to get money and a loan. And then they produce interest, obviously, and that interest doesn't exist in the money supply. So you have today about 200 trillion in debt in the world and about 80 trillion in currency. So what does that mean? It means that those that are holding the bag in the lower class are the ones that get screwed when you have economic declines. There are always going to be bankruptcies and things like that that happen in a kind of classism, the structural classism that I call it, that effectively hurts the lower class. And the fact that people don't see that either. I mean, debt goes back 5,000 years. It has been in lockstep of something else that we're familiar with called slavery. So debt, peonage, slavery, convict leasing. Even today in certain areas of Asia, they have debt that's passed through generations from farmer to child, and that child has to continue working off its father's debt in effectively a kind of post-neo-feudalism. So this phenomenon is there. And it's unfortunate that more people don't see the actual intrinsic problem of debt. And the solution to that, you can argue that you could get rid of a debt-based currency and so on. And I've had many conversations with people about that. But the question is, why hasn't it happened? Because it's intrinsic to the function of capitalism. So the banks are, just as the early forefathers of America knew, are one of the most criminal institutions because they can do this. And it's not even that they act insidiously. It's just what their job is. Their job is to make money out of nothing, sell it to people, and then when the people can't pay it, they take their property. And that property goes, it's just another funneling system. And here's another thing I'll mention. All the money that's made in the world comes from the lower class taking loans. So right now, less than 63% of Americans have $1,000 in savings. Yet the lower class, that same subclass, is what takes on all the major loans, home loans, car loans. That money comes in, the people buy all this stuff, and then that money that's spent goes basically right back up to the upper class again, because as we know through the growth of the past 10 years, all of the major income has gone to the upper 5 to 10%. So it's even worse now. So you see my point? So the people take on all the loans of the entire collective money in society, and then that money is extracted through them through various forms of structural classism and goes right back up to the upper 1%. People should be enraged by that. But they don't see it because it's a structural phenomenon. It's something that's happening under the surface that isn't readily apparent. And that's why, due to ignorance, no one really reacts on it.
It seems like no matter who's in the White House, Obama, Hillary, or Trump, Goldman Sachs turns out to be the winner. And even Trump, based his whole campaign saying, I'm not a Goldman Sachs shill, and look what his cabinet is stacked with.
Yeah.
I mean, how powerful is Wall Street in terms of controlling the political spectrum?
It's very covert, but it's definitely an enormous power because the financial sector is like the polluting force that underlies everything. And it's very difficult for people to understand that the major corporations have to be in bed with these major banks, and due to financialization, they ultimately bleed over into investment banks. So much money is made by major corporations that people don't even know about, have nothing to do with goods and services. They have to do with this recycling and financialization and reinvesting and this and that. There's a whole subclass of all major corporations that reinvest everything that they've done, and they employ Wall Street to do so. And that is deeply caustic, and again, it separates anything from true economic production. Wall Street, as people have talked about since the American Revolution, the banking system has been given this privilege. I'll say it this way. There's a privilege that banks, investment banks, commercial banks, and effectively the financialization has had, and it's been unquestioned, and that's basically the control of money and artifacts that relate to money but have no intrinsic value. Again, that's why I advocate the abolition of Wall Street and the entire thing. These derivatives upon derivatives. And so we create this housing bubble, right? So the housing market, abusing of people that are in need, and basically triggering the systemic crisis that these people at the top made a fortune off of, but then contributed to public health outcomes such as 500,000 people that died of cancer because they couldn't get treatment, or the 50 million people that committed suicide over the course measured and related to the financial crisis in America and Europe. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the financial relationship to public health.
Let's talk about empire. Of course, we see U.S. military presence in over 70% of all the nations on Earth. When you look at military personnel, it's almost every single country. But beyond military hegemony, there's the hegemony of U.S. capital. Of course, this is more hidden. But how does this financialization underpin the empire?
Since the fall of the Soviet Union and the development of the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, NATO, underlying all of these higher structure institutions is neoliberal globalization and financialization. Those three words have to kind of go together because it's one synergy. And since the attempt at a different type of social order has been officially squashed, the World Bank and the IMF have gone out of its way to make sure neoliberal policy is employed everywhere in any country that doesn't have that interest, such as Iran, such as Iraq, such as Syria, such as a long list of countries, such as Libya, that have tried to do something different or have been on the outs for whatever reason, but usually have economic roots that go back in history to some degree. Any country that tries to step out of the way gets hit with the idea that they are violating human rights, because in this world, at least in the perception of democracy that we have, neoliberalism is supposed to be right next to it. The idea of free markets. Of course, it's not really free at all. That's the thing about it. It's not really neoliberalism, because that would mean everything would be open. That's the true idea of neoliberalism, that when the people that came up with this word decades ago, they said, well, we need some kind of philosophy to counter communism. We want to promote open free markets across all borders. And of course, no one actually did that. So it's that lure of neoliberal thought, but it's really just a function of the wealthy class gets the socialist support as usual, and the lower class countries or individuals are the ones that have to suffer through neoliberal free market outcomes. They're the ones that get to fight and lose. But the upper class states like the United States and empire, United States empire, it's not susceptible to any of this, because it's just the bully in the room. It's the big empire, and it has its vassal states that help, and it has its arm of NATO, and it has all its World Bank, IMF institutions to support its economic worldview, which eventually leads to its territorial and geopolitical control of other nations, because that force won't tolerate anything else. So yeah, it's really insidious, and we've had now an empire that's built really on economic coercion more than anything else. And I mean, the military bases are still powerful. They're there, and they're clearly functional. But the economic power yielded in the ideology of neoliberalism has been the true driving force of control. But I would definitely argue that their fear of communism and their fear of losing American, Western, and effectively capitalist hegemony brought in this idea of neoliberalism, and the idea that if we don't employ and force this old Adam Smith invisible hand idea across the world, then we're going to lose our seat of control, ultimately.
Expand more on the notion that all wars are class wars.
You can look at society as a stratified structure, both in any domestic society, such as the United States, where you, of course, you have the rich and the poor and the dwindling middle class. Then you can apply that exact same macro view to the states, the nation states of the world. And it's amazing to see how close in resemblance they are. You know, what would the middle class nations of the world be? I'd say they'd be kind of like the social democracies of Europe, the ones you don't hear about too much, the ones that are under the wing of empires, such as Sweden. You know, Sweden and the Nordic countries have great public health. They're doing different things. They're sort of global middle class. They have their problems, but they're also very much in cahoots with empire. You know, Sweden, its military production, and so on. So those elements are mirrored very well, and lower class nations, just like lower class citizens, tend to be those of a fringe and ignored class. So lower class citizens, those in America, the echoes of slavery, any migrants, the general poor that have been poor through generations, those are the ones that continue to have the same type of oppression, because they're also the ones that want to see actual change in the political system in America. So, the drug war, all those kind of imposing forces that have been instated over the course of many generations are there to make sure the poor remains weak and impotent. And the same type of structures exist on the macro level simultaneously. So again, back to these other nations, these other Middle Eastern countries, after World War II, any country that simply wanted to do something different outside of, again, the neoliberal order had to suffer the same fate. So the World Bank, what do? They oppose austerity. They keep those countries poor and destroyed. And that's a great way, if there's no infrastructure in these countries to start to develop new ideas or new patterns, then there's no threat. So, and of course, there's the grudge. There's always going to be an element that is an echo of our economic dominance, U.S. economic dominance, or just, this pattern of economic dominance that builds in other forms of bias. And I have no doubt, that Western society, with its increasingly jingoistic views and this reversion back into a xenophobic presence, whether it's, claiming that Mexicans are stealing their jobs, or that the Arab communities and the Muslim communities are now the hub of this terrorist ideology and so on, these things foment after the fact and create long-term patterns of bias and bigotry.
I like that you brought up a macro and micro in terms of the classism in America and also the global classism, because people talk about the developed world and the underdeveloped world as if that's just the way it is, instead of the underdeveloped world actually giving way to why we have a developed
Well, I mean, colonization
today.
Colonization, as you know very well, is effectively a sprawling class antagonism. It's a subjugation. You know, the poor of the world are not poor because they've been left behind in market capitalism. They're poor because of these years of colonization that have destroyed Africa and areas of Latin America.
You call your new book a logical train of thought from a social psychology perspective. And let's start with the notion that poverty is violence, right? Go over some of the casualties that arise from the structural violence that exists today in this system.
The big word I use is socioeconomic inequality, which poverty falls under the umbrella of. Socioeconomic inequality, basically class stratification, has been held up as some kind of innovator force, some force of innovation. Oh, yeah, that's about the only defense of it you'll hear. They'll say, well, you know, you got to have poor people that aspire to be rich people, and that will create the engine of innovation. More nonsense is produced by industry. That's effectively the only defense I've ever heard of stratification, other than people claiming it's a biological reality and there's no other choice than for us to be these primitive primates that stratify, and therefore the bottom rungs will suffer. It's not just poverty that's the worst form of violence, as Gandhi stated. To be in a stratified system is against well-being and public health. That's been proven by a lot of different theorists in epidemiology, where they measured all of these artifacts, such as the level of violence. In fact, Dr. James Gilligan, which I know you've interviewed, he's the former head of the study of violence at Harvard, extremely brilliant man who studied this as a prison psychologist, and his core statement, you want to reduce violence in society, reduce inequality. Because it has he even discusses it on the broad state level too. The highest measure, more inequality in a society, more violence, more inequality between countries, more violence across that spectrum too, between countries. So that's just one thing. So there's also the psychosocial stress, that we are killing each other through plaques in our arteries from the release of certain stress hormones that are directly attributed to socioeconomic inequality as well. In other words, the more you're involved in a class-based society, the more you witness the haves and the have-nots, the more it messes you up, and it's biologically associated. So this is an unnatural state. So poverty and socioeconomic inequality kill about 18 million a year based on one estimate. So that is a couple Holocausts in 1 year. They say the Soviet Union killed 100 million people in 1 century of its existence. We're killing in capitalist inequality, capitalist-generated inequality, that many in 6 years. So the defense of a class stratified society is no longer existent in the public health research.
Under capitalism, there's always going to be people who are poor, right? Why is this notion that this is just a constant inevitability that we have to accept? Poverty, unemployment in the system, booms and busts. This is the most odd thing to me about capitalism, is the acceptance that these things are natural.
First of all, the massive vehicles of class war. Every time there's a bust, it doesn't affect, the wealthy can endure that. So they can find ways to work around it, but that creates cheap labor, boom, better for the owners of the country and the owners of big business and finance. They take foreclosures. The financial services sector effectively booms during this because they're the ones that get to grab up everything the lower class can't pay for anymore. And then when the boom starts happening again, the QE or all the things that the central banks do invariably go into the powerful corporate and financial sectors, because we still have that philosophy of trickle down. We still have the idea that you have to pump money into big business and effectively the stock market in order to generate more activity that will float down to the lower class. So yeah, it's really transparent, and no, it doesn't have to exist.
Let's talk about the inefficiencies of the capitalist model versus the possibilities that exist today with modern technology. But before you launch off into both of these things, first let's talk about the inefficiencies that exist today.
Well, the greatest inefficiency would be the fact that we have poverty at all. So we talk about this advancement of society and this great productivity. The most powerful force, the most positive force we do have of the whole of human civilization is, since the Industrial Revolution, we're able to do more and more and more with less and less and less. And that is the driving force that can create equitable distribution and peace on this planet. So the fact that you have 5 people now with more wealth than the bottom half of the world, and you have close to 1 billion people not getting their nutrition met, and you have what Peter Edwards of Newcastle University put out what he called the ethical poverty line, which is based on lifespan, not the metrics put out by the UN. And when you use this ethical poverty line, you find that 60% of the world is actually in poverty. That is lunacy from an efficiency standpoint. No one can sit there and claim that this is an efficient system when that's the outcome on the social level. Now, we can talk about the efficiency of a factory and all the great fruits of technology that people will claim are associated with capitalism, which is nonsense too. It's our ability to design and our ingenuity through science and technology that's created this, not some weird mechanism that's attributed to capitalism.
And what about food and waste?
The waste is absolutely insane. You have 40% of all food being wasted because of inefficiencies in the distribution pipeline, which is staggering. You know, we have the globalization moving food all around. You have the average American food plate moves about 1,400 miles. There's no reason for any of that, especially now. So
And now let's juxtapose that, right? From food to energy to everything that you're talking about, housing. What is the crazy juxtaposition of what is possible with the technology that we have?
If you go down the line of what's possible, you remove the chaos of human society and its strange beliefs and everything else, and you actually look at what we can do, then there's no reason for anyone to be hungry, obviously. There could be an incredible state of efficiency and abundance across food and energy and production. So when we talk about abundance, it's so confused with people because I get attacked all day long. Like, the world is finite. We can't make an abundance. Obviously it's a relative notion. I mean, the sun will eventually burn out. It's abundant to us in the long term of time. So it's not about suddenly there's a magical amount of everything. It's about using the efficiency and of course focusing the economy on the interest to have an abundance, because in our current society, it's the antithesis of what's rewarded. We reward scarcity. We want things to be generally scarce. The corporate construct does. Business doesn't want there to be an abundance of anything. So the pollution of the water supply, that's great for the water bottling companies. So we're rewarding the exact opposite. So you can't have sustainability, preservation, efficiency in a society that rewards the opposite. And therein lies the great contradiction of the capitalist system.
And in terms of energy, I mean, what is possible right now? I remember reading that just such a small area in like Africa could power the entire continent plus part of Europe. I mean,
I do an analysis in the book that just looks at all the basic renewables, and each one of them has the capacity to create a global abundance and meet the current needs. And you put them all together in a synergy, and then make basic what's called mixed-use systems. It's a little bit technical, but we don't have any kind of systemic incorporation in our cities, not like they should be. Every single house today should have solar panels that not only power the home as much as possible, but they run the energy back out into a central grid. Suddenly everything becomes an attribute of energy development. It's shared. And you do that if someone created a society there's a few smaller cities in Europe that are doing that with outrageous efficiency potential. So when you put all that together, it's absurd. It's absurd. Everyone in small pockets and these entrepreneurs are doing their best, even like Elon Musk and the battery technology, and they're trying to do something, but there's no concentrated focus. There needs to be basically a Manhattan Project to figure out what the best solution is globally, to unify the synergies of all of our renewables and to make them all work. And if we did that, if we actually got the minds of, say, all the universities together right now, and you had a university project across the entire world and said, we're going to focus on this problem right now. What is the combination of renewables? How do we distribute it across the world? And how do we make it create an abundance at zero cost effectively? And I guarantee if you did that, it would happen probably in 6 months.